Hello everybody here in the audience at Kunsthalle Wien, and hello everybody out there in the World Wide Web. I already noticed we have some people following our conversation live at home. So it's my pleasure to talk tonight to Willem de Rooij. Willem de Rooij is an artist and since 2006 has been professor at the Städelschule in Frankfurt. His work is determined by the selection and combination of images in diverse media, such as sculpture, film, photography, and text. It analyzes the conventions of presentation and representation and assesses the tension between socio-political and autonomous image production. Where early film installations already had a sculptural quality, Van Rooij's more recent exhibitions became works of art in their own right, often incorporating found materials or appropriated works of art. You will have a solo show later this year at Museum für Moderne Kunst in Frankfurt. Last year you had solo exhibitions, among others, at Le Consortium in Dijon, at Index, the Swedish Contemporary Art Foundation in Stockholm, at the Weltkulturenmuseum in Frankfurt am Main, and at the Witte de Wit in Rotterdam. The year before you showed Index, Riots, Protest, Mourning and Commemoration at Fini in Bristol. That's a very important work of yours, and I think we're going to talk about it tonight. And yeah, there was a very good show at the Kunstverein Munich in 2012. I think we will also talk about some works from this exhibition or works from this series today, and another very important exhibition in terms of the subject of this Exposition Imaginaire is of course Intolerance at Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin, which was on display in 2010. From 1994 to 2006 you mainly collaborated with Joan de Rooij, who sadly passed away in 2006. And Jeroen and you represented the Netherlands at the Venice Biennial in 2005. So, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Shall we start with some of the images you sent us earlier today, or would you like me to elaborate a bit further why we invited you to talk within the framework of Exposition Imaginaire? What I find very interesting about your work is your ongoing interest in the image as a source of information, in the image as something that can circulate, in the image that is a container for meaning but also for ideology. And I think many of your works question the readability of images of different kinds by recontextualizing them or putting them in a new context.
Yeah, I would say so as well. I'm also always very interested in not only the reading of images but also the misreading of them. So the miscommunications and the rubbings that come out of miscommunications, I always find very productive.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, so this is the first image. This is the Index, Riots, Protest, Mourning and Commemoration.
Yeah, there's a couple of images of this installation, and if I'm not mistaken, there should also be a detail. Is that correct? Do you have a zoom in of that? No, that's not it. Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
I think at the very end. Sorry. Oh, it's a PDF, sorry. Yeah, this is part of these talks. Okay, here we go. Okay, we leave it like that. Sorry.
I'm just wondering if... I was wondering if there's a detail, because I thought I also sent you a detail, but maybe that didn't arrive.
You sent the folder. You sent the Arnolfini folder.
Yeah, exactly. The exhibition guide, yeah?
Yeah. Here we go.
Can you find that? Yeah, exactly. There's a see, so that's what I wanted you to see, because this work named Index, I'll tell you a little bit about how that was made. Index is basically a collection of images that were cut out of newspapers in the period from, let's say, mid-1999 to early 2002. So right around the millennium swap. And all these images depict groupings of people when they come together in moments to share either emotions or grief, or in moments of protest or revolt. So they're emotional group meetings, and these group meetings have all sorts of different characters, and so do the depictions of them. And sometimes these group meetings will have a very staged character. In the case of protest marches and certain commemorative meetings, and at other moments these meetings will be more, let's say, improvised or spontaneous. And I, in the late 1990s, became interested in these group meetings. There was anyway an enhanced visibility of these kind of meetings. There were protests in Seattle and in Genua. The so-called anti-globalization movement was at that moment important. This movement had a lot of visibility, mainly because of the actions they produced and organized, and the images that came out of these actions. And I was wondering, not only what do these actions mean, but what do the choices mean that the people make that participate in these actions in the sense of how do they stage themselves and how do they wish to be depicted. And then, of course, the question that comes after is, what choices do the photographers make that are aware of these meetings, that move around it? What choices do editors make who worked for newspapers? And in the end, what choices can the readers make, and the consumers of these images? I collected, and all of this was part of a larger interest in, let's say, the capacity for images to carry or transfer political interests and social interests, interests that have to do with community or with the direct life surroundings of normal people, let's say, or of all the people. And I was not so sure what images can do in this dynamic and this debate, and that's why I started to collect these newspaper clippings. What for me, in these couple of years, I collected around 500-600 images, and in the end, after 2 years of collecting, they found a place on 18 panels that are made of, let's say, paper boards. So I organized these images in chronological order, and they became consolidated in a series of 18 panels that are shown together as one piece since then, and that piece is called Index. And this work, Index, is only one of the pieces that came out of that interest of mine and that investigation. Another piece that came out of that would be a film that I made together with Willem de Rooij at that time in 2000. This is a movie called Punta Cabana, a 10-minute, 35mm film that was shot in the outskirts of Jakarta in Indonesia, on the central garbage disposal area of that large city, Jakarta. And how do people move around and live on and around that garbage disposal area. A film about waste, but also about how to live and how to work, and how to depict these phenomena. Now, what you're seeing now behind you are some details of images that feature on the panels that form the piece called Index. Now, if you go back, Vanessa, maybe to an image of the installation where you can see those panels. For instance, exactly. This is an installation view at Arnolfini in Bristol, where the pieces, the 18 panels, turned out to fit exactly into the room that I was given for that show. That was a very, very happy installation because we brought the pieces into the room, and as soon as they came out of the boxes, they were actually already in place. It was the easiest installation I ever had, and a really good-looking one, I thought, in the end. That is not always the case, of course. I decided for that exhibition in Bristol to show not only these 18 panels, but also a flower work, a work that is consisting out of 98 different flowers. And they all have to find their spot in that vase that you see. It's a very complex arrangement that is refreshed maybe once or twice a week. And I look at that piece as a group of individuals, because every flower is there represented in this group only once. And every one of them is in that sense unique in this constellation. Now the piece Index, as you see it behind the flower work, the different panels that are hanging on the wall. As I said, the images are chronologically ordered. There are no captions to these images on the actual panels, but there is also a booklet that comes with the installation that is in the exhibition room that makes it possible to find the original captions as they were published in the newspapers at the time with these images. You can find them back in this booklet. So not only what is to be seen on the images, the context and the reason for these group meetings, but also the photographer and the press agency and the newspaper and the date of release are all mentioned in this booklet, so that the context can be found if a viewer wants to or not.
I mean, to me, I really like this piece a lot. I've seen it several times, like in real. It's very close to the ideas of Warburg, and also, I think, in a way, to Mallarmé's Musée Imaginaire. Because maybe that was not obvious when you only look at like selected images. On each panel there's like images of the same category, and when you start to compare these like mainly like press images, then you see that there's like a repetitive pattern of like certain gestures, and then after a while you recognize they look very familiar because they look like restaged, really like historical or like religious paintings, especially for instance the figure of like mourning women always have something like very like sacred, like virgin and child about them. And to me that's always been very fascinating to see how much our media society in a way has to go back to this kind of like, let's call it like collective iconography, to visualize like complex situations in these like very condensed compositions.
Yeah, I think it goes. I totally agree. I find that really fascinating as well. And I think, as you say, like many of these images seem to go back on long iconographic traditions, look familiar, feel familiar. So it's easy to assume when you're looking at this group of images that the photographers obviously have this history in mind. as well as the persons who select the images. But I would assume also the protesters themselves. I think they must know about this as well. And at the same time, I do think that those classic images that we know so well and that have a long history, or classic constellations, or classic is such a weird word, but let's say compositions that we know so well, that they also became repeated for a reason. And I remember a weird moment. This is so. This is something that everybody likes to talk about. But the moment that we all heard that there had 2 airplanes flown into the Twin Towers in New York, my own response, looking at the television with a group of people in a snack bar in Rotterdam, I saw a plane and it hit the tower, and it was such a shocking image to me that I saw myself going like this, like, out of Shrek, or out of I don't know, out of what. So, and I was able to observe myself while that happened. And I thought that's also like a very classical gesture of shock that I had never made before, I thought, or I didn't remember. And I was wondering, where does that gesture come from, or where does that physical response come from? Because I only knew it from images. And there was a very strange and interesting little moment in that story that is obviously a little bigger than my personal observations. But that's where I started thinking, maybe particular gestures and postures and ways of behaving or grouping go beyond the knowledge of imagery and wanting to copy them, either knowingly or not.
So that's a pre-digital feedback loop.
Maybe. Yeah. Anyway, this whole project called Index was obviously a pre-digital feedback loop, because weirdly, as we look at these images now, it might look a little bit like Google Image. That, of course, existed in the times when these images were collected by me, but it did not have the significance that it has now. Also not as a medium for artists or as a tool for artists. What I can really see on this project is that at that time I was actually reading newspapers every day, more than one. So there were all these piles of actual paper in my studio. That is of course not the case anymore. So that's where this piece also marks an interesting moment in the production of images. And at the same time, it marks some other important moments. It marks important moments in world history purely by coincidence, because I happened to be collecting those images then. But if you walk past these 18 panels, the Twin Tower attacks will at one point pop up, and all the events that preceded these attacks and that came afterwards. There were in this period 2 political murders in the Netherlands, where I was living at the time, that had a big impact on social and political life in that country. So those are, kind of key moments in history as well that passed by. In the turn of the century, obviously.
Shall we have a look at the weavings? They come next. Because I think they are like a sharp contrast. And at the same time, I mean, on closer inspection, I think they fit very much into your, let's call it like private policy of images, or like about the refusal to like show images. Because with this looks like paintings, but actually it's like fabrics. It's Weavings.
Yeah, these are works. I sent you a couple of images from an exhibition I made in Los Angeles last year. This exhibition was called Legal Noses. And it features 9 woven works, like textile works, wall objects, I call them, to try and avoid the connotation with painting, which is very hard with these works, because they look a lot like painting, especially on a reproduction. But these are actually fabrics that are hand woven by a hand weaver in Potsdam, outside of Berlin. I produced these images or these fabrics together with the weaver. So we produce special yarn in order to come to special combinations of colors and structures. And this set that you're looking at now is based on classical Chinese puzzle named Tangram. I think, did I send you an image of the Tangram? Yep. Like, maybe you can show that. Yeah, exactly. This is like a set of birds that can be made out of the 7 forms that form together the Tangram. And these 7 forms together form a square. And since I started making these weavings, maybe around 10 years ago, one of the objectives, or one of the thoughts I had when I started making these works, is that I saw a lot of artworks around me that derived their meaning or their interestingness out of external references. So it very often happened that I walked into a show and saw a couple of works, read a press release, and then the press release would refer to all sorts of interesting source material, maybe text or films or whatever. But then that interesting material was never in the room. And that made me feel quite sad and also a little lonely, because I thought, if I'm reading now about this fabulous source material, but I feels like I'm not allowed to see it. And I wondered about that relation between something that is wonderful on the one hand, that the artist feels the need to refer to, and on the other hand, the absence of that very interesting thing that is then not there. And I thought this kind of aboutness, as I started calling it, the fact that many works seem to be about something, that became more and more of an issue for me. And I started to investigate different ways of circumnavigating this aboutness, because I felt I would like to have either a more direct relation to those interesting things, or no relation at all. And that meant that quite a few installations that I've built since then integrate existing material, sometimes artworks by other artists, either living or from the far past, or design objects, or let's say existing objects, more and more found a way into the work in order to circumnavigate this notion of aboutness, so that I would not have to refer to what these interesting objects are about. I rather chose to show them in the exhibition space. And another strategy I have been testing since then, I thought I would like to make works that are about nothing. There I have to say, I think till now I've pretty much failed, because the works that have to come out of that, or that came out of this line of thinking, it seems that people can project all sorts of fantasies and desired meanings on them, pretty much endless. So that's where there's still some work for me to do until I arrive at the work that is about nothing, but I'm not going to give up. So I'm still hopeful that will work sometime soon. Another effect that happened in these weavings is that this became a group of work that grew over a period of the last 8 to 10 years. They mainly refer to each other. So it became a very introverted group of work. And there are some perks to that, I think, and that's interesting. And at the same time, I also find that self-referentiality of this group of work sometimes rather claustrophobic. So it has different sides. Now, the group of works that you are now showing, Vanessa, the works that were shown in Los Angeles, as I said, they all were based on the tangram figure that hosts 7 different forms that form together a square. But if you take it apart, it can produce thousands of other forms. And those birds that you showed were only one of the possibilities. So it's actually kind of a set of forms that can be one cohesive form, but can be many other forms as well, and can keep on changing form and meaning and shape. The colors that I used for these weavings are all the colors that I have used in other weavings before. I'm working with a very reduced palette and with a reduced set of sizes. The sizes are all based on what the looms that I work on can do. These looms are sometimes very old. The weaving workshop that I work with has been existing since the 1920s, but some of their looms are 300 years old. The fabrics that come off these looms are stretched on stretcher bars so that they can be hung on the wall. And the palette of colors came out of different context I've been working in these 10 years. There's works that are pink, there's works that are silver or gold or black or brown, and then there's works that are yellow and works that are blue. So these 7 colors were the colors I was using till then. The number 7 coincided with the amount of elements that construct the tangram, and that's why I decided to make 7 works that have the shapes of this tangram in these 7 colors. And if you bring them together, they will make a big square that looks like the big square that you're seeing in the beginning, earlier on in the images that you've shown. So again, like a very self-referential group of works that can talk about what a blue work actually means or a pink work really means. But in the end, they really talk about each other. All the different colors are part of each work. So even if you're looking at a blue triangle on the left-hand side, now on the image that you're showing, the undertones in that work will also contain yellow and brown and silver and gold and pink. So all these colors are all there. And by the intermingling of these different colors that go in 2 different directions as a weaving is constructed, so the horizontal lines and the vertical lines, these colors will change depending on where you stand as a viewer and depending on the light in the room.
I find this very interesting because that is another work of yours which tries everything in order not to be an artwork that can be reproduced. When you look at the image of the work, then you see nothing of the real works. I mean, they really demand a viewer in front of the work. They have to be presented in a space. They correspond with the light. They even like responds to your the movement of the viewer in front of the surface of the image. And I think that's something that started very early, even when you and Joan worked on your first films. I mean, you never liked the idea, for instance, of film stills or like any other images that try to like represent the artwork as a whole. And just like, because you just talked about blue, and I think that's a small piece, but I like it very much. There is this film, I'm Coming Home in 40 Days from 1997, and the very last image in this film is completely like blue. But it's not an abstract image, it's actually the water on top of ice, and filmed from right on top. And you use the a still from this film in different catalogs and publications, but you also gave it like as a press image, and then you selected all the reproductions of these stills and showed them in exhibitions, because of course blue is never blue. So you had like these different shapes of blue, and of course, like without knowing the film, nobody could say what it actually was that the person was looking at, because it just looked like monochrome blue, but actually it was a still from a film about an iceberg off the coast of Greenland.
Yeah, we always had big trouble trying to represent films, because obviously anything time-based is getting lost in still reproduction. For us, the notion of time in making time-based work was one of the most important things. So we always felt quite tricked if we saw our work reproduced as a still, and felt that nothing that we found important about that work was transmitted through a still. And that's how we came in the end to, as you described, like using a rather bland blue rectangle as a representation of a film that's really about something else, but then thinking of how that rectangle would be reproduced in different media, and that blue would always be printed in another way. That was something very exciting to us. And then in the end, when we saw, or when we were able to bring a couple of these reproductions together, it was indeed, you could see how that blue square started, to mutate and to have many more different faces than what you would expect if you see only one reproduction of it. So then the mass of reproduced stills kind of formed a new, unstable, but more multifaceted idea of what that film would be. And reproductions have been a huge fascination of mine in my own work, also a huge curse and a huge burden and a huge challenge, and also a huge joy, because for certain installations I've more and more started to understand that a really important part of my work is happening in the installation of works. So the image that you see behind you, this is not only a grouping of individual works. It really is thought as a total, as an installation in itself. And the particular grouping of these works in that particular space on that particular moment has a significance. So the documentation not only of works themselves, but also of installations, that I'm more and more starting to see these installations as works also. That reproduction became very important. And that means that whenever I have the possibility, I work more and more with one particular photographer that I befriended, and whose work I'm a great admirer of, and who has been able to understand what I like in reproduction, how I like those installations to look in reproduction. And I think also through the years, I've become more aware of what a work will look like as a reproduction while I'm installing a show. So that's of course where I learned and became more aware of what's going to happen to the afterlife of a temporary installation. And this is something I've been speaking a lot about this with contemporaries, with colleagues, but also with students who are obviously younger than I am. And there is sometimes the tendency to talk about documentation as if that is a problem of the present, And as if that is something that became more important since there is Instagram and Facebook. I am not someone who believes that. I think documentation was always very important. I think temporary installations have always been there. The problem of documenting something that is limited in time was as important for performers in the 1960s and 70s as it was for I'm thinking of the Romanian sculptor who makes the Brancusi, who photographed his own work in his own studio in different constellations in order to find out what do the sculptures do to the space, and questions of documentation are as old as photography, I would say. So I'm always a little bit hesitant to see it as a contemporary trope.
I think the main difference is now we have a more like global look that lots of photographers doing installation views want to share a certain look. If you just like browse through Contemporary Art Daily, I have the impression that all the exhibitions on this platform have happened in the same gallery because it all looks the same. I mean, it's always like white walls and this grayish floor and no windows and a certain kind of light. And I even have the feeling that they are selected because they have this like very generic look. Whereas earlier installation views had like a very characteristic look, and I think Brancusi is a fantastic example because he did not like the way other people photographed his work, so he started to do it himself.
Yeah.
So, and it was also like this taking care of like that the reproduction in a way fits the idea of the work, because I think even that days artists were aware of the fact that these images start to circulate, and that lots of people will only like see the reproduction and never encounter the real work.
Yeah, I think then of, isn't that Rubens who started to circulate his work as prints, and I think many artists did, but then I think, if I'm not mistaken, Rubens had invented a particular kind of copyright through which he was the only one allowed to produce and circulate prints that were made in his own studio of his own work. Interesting, like how exactly the circulation and understanding that most people will see your work through reproduction instead of in real. When it comes to Contemporary Art Daily, I think the fact that all these images look so much alike is exactly because that platform is anything but a global platform. There's absolutely nothing global about Contemporary Art Daily. What you see there is art from Northwestern Europe and North America, and absolutely nowhere else. So it's kind of like the most narrow keyhole kind of niche view on the world and the art that is produced in the world that I can think of. And I think it's a fantastic platform, super interesting, informative, but it represents a teeny little sliver of what the art world or the world and the art in it have to offer. And that's a great shame. It would be fantastically interesting if there would be a platform that would bring together documentation of shows that actually are from all over the world. But I do not know such a platform, sadly. And given this, the recent vogue in art that is shown on important platforms, like maybe the Berlin Biennial or the Manifesta in Zurich or on other large and important platforms in Europe and the United States, it doesn't seem as if that is going to change anytime soon, because it looks like there's a pretty intense neo-reactionary backlash that favors art made by white people in the north of Europe. The north of the west of Europe, because it's even smaller than that, because even Warsaw is too far away in this circle that I'm describing. Yeah, that would be fun if there would be an antidote to all that. Let's hope that that will come soon, and let's work on that.
Am I allowed to click to the next image? Because now we come to something completely, not yet, different.
Yeah, this is an exhibition. These are images of an exhibition I made in Dijon last year in Consortium. A fantastically beautiful exhibition space where I showed a selection of tracksuits from my personal collection. And I've been collecting these tracksuits for maybe 10 years also. They are all made by a Dutch fashion designer called Phong Leng. She became well known in the Netherlands in the 1970s and 80s. As a maker of exclusive couture objects for particular clients. And these good couture objects were always made of leather, often very elaborately decorated and detailed. And as I said, they were made for particular clients. Somewhere in the late 80s and early 90s, the work of Phong Leng changed to a certain extent, and she started to produce works for a larger audience. There were collaborations with Levi's and with Adidas, and the work shifted from something that is made for the few into something that is made for the many. And suddenly larger groups of people were able to afford works by this artist who was known to make exclusive objects before. And this transition I found interesting, the difference in audience and the difference in target group, and consequently the difference in artistic output, how different these tracksuits look from the earlier design objects. Another thing that I found interesting in these tracksuits is that many of them, let's say, quote abstract ideas of different cultures. So let's say cultural signifiers that are borrowed from maybe African printing, West African printing techniques, or maybe Navajo, Native American form, Sprache, formal language, or maybe Chinese inspired embroideries. So there was a wish in this sportswear to be alluding to ideals that were politically supported at the time in the Netherlands, but I think in Western Europe in general, the ideas of a multicultural society where it would be possible for people from different cultural and ethnic spheres to live together and keep the important characteristics of their cultures intact. And I found that fascinating looking back, because I don't think that at this moment it is in the world of sportswear for a large audience. I'm not really seeing how marketing otherness can be a profitable undertaking. So I find that interesting, and I find the difference interesting and how the times have changed in that sense. What I like about these outfits also is that there are these different typologies where they might look very similar at a distance, but if you zoom in on the details on these suits, you're going to see so many differences. And that raises many questions about who actually made them, and where these earlier works of Phong Leng, this detail that you're showing now is a good example of one of those African-inspired printing forms. This is quite directly based on there's two printing techniques, one used in Ghana and one used in Nigeria. I think in Nigeria they call it adire, and in Ghana they call it adinkra. This is a stamping technique that is very old, but is still used, and is based in each of these two countries on a different set of symbols that have been developing through centuries, and as I said, are still used. I found it interesting to see how directly from Leng is, let's say, borrowing or quoting these kind of formal elements in order to come to an interesting pattern.
If we look at the presentation of the tracksuits, I mean, from this image, one could say like they look like a fashion display. I mean, you have these mannequins with the clothes on it. Which kind of like information was provided to the audience? Was it like samples from Willem de Rooij's collection, or was there like more info on these, like just mentioned, like printing techniques, about the designer, about the time when the clothes were designed, like in which edition they were sold, etc. The exhibition, by the way, had like a very nice title, The Impassioned No.
The Impassioned No is, titles are always very difficult for me, and since I've been started studying art in the late 80s, I started making lists of titles because I thought that will always then be helpful if I need a title. So that is by now like a really, really long list with a lot of fabulous titles, but of course every time when I'm making a piece and I need a title, it's never on that list. So the list keeps growing longer and longer, but my problem hasn't changed. And not so long ago, I started to take, let's say, cues from the context of a show or a work and make them into anagrams in order to make it easier on myself. The exhibition in Dijon was curated by the French curator Stéphanie Moidon, very fantastic, talented, amazing curator. So great to work with her. The Impassioned No is an anagram of her name. I thought it was very fitting because Stéphanie Moidon is a woman who can say no in a very convincing manner. So I thought that fit very well. The word no, I think, has anyway, in my class in Frankfurt, we talk about that word a lot. Like, what is the, how is it? I think for a young artist, but also for an older artist like myself, to say no is one of the most powerful tools that we have during our operations in the art world, but also in the studio. And of course, meaning no also implies always saying yes, but being clear about when to say no and when to say yes. So it is about that, about discriminating, about making a difference and understanding a difference. And that's why we talk a lot about the word no in class. And the displays that you're looking at, like there were three, in total there were around 50 mannequins carrying 50 different outfits on show in that exhibition. And they were grouped in groups of 1, 2, or 3. So there were pedestals made that can host 1 person, 2 persons, or 3 persons. Well, they're not persons, they're mannequins, but they feel a little bit like persons when they're standing there. And this had to do, for me, with thinking about social groupings. The duo and the trio that will become a group, and the individual. So there's these 3 possibilities, and there's 2 different heights. And that's how I could create like a landscape where these figures could find a place in, let's say. And these different groupings or different social constellations, I think, were mirrored a little bit in 3 flower works that were shown in that exhibition. One of them we have seen earlier, in an image of that index installation, the piece that was made out of 98 very different flowers. But there was also, for instance, in this show in Consortium, there was a piece that was made out of a whole group of very different flowers that had only one thing in common, and that was that they were all white. And that is a piece that has then, like for me, talks about sameness and difference at the same time. So very often these kind of flower works, but also weavings will speak of more abstract constellations, and then social constellations can be one of those thoughts that transfer into a work like that. There's also weavings, for instance, that will show a gradation, so that one end of the weaving has one color and then it slowly merges and ends up in another color. And for me, these are pieces that do not only speak about the space or that they're in, or about what happens to color in different light, but it's also a piece about change in general, about how one extreme can merge into another and what happens in the middle. So
I like how you refer to artworks as like speaking objects.
Yeah, I know they can't speak, but I mean,
No, but I mean that's maybe like also like to bring this to an end, although I could, continue to talk to you forever and ever. No, but I think for me that's the main difference between like looking at a reproduction like we do now, or like being in the exhibition, because then of course like this tracksuit wearing mannequins on this different like pedestal, of course they have something weird like naturemort and same like person-like about them, and I think you look at the things like differently, and I think it's one thing when you look at an image, then you feel tempted to talk about all these like cultural references, because you know that the information is there and it needs to be decoded. That's what we do when we look at images. But when we look at an artwork, then of course we try to like decode the artwork too. But there is lots of things which happen on a more like intuitive level. And I think also there's like these speaking objects, and of course there's this like dialogue between the individual works and the space and the viewer. And I think it's more like a kind of like informed whisper.
Yeah, I'm finding I'm learning about the information that can or cannot be hidden in these objects while I'm working and while I'm producing these constellations. It's always strange because people usually think that the artist knows everything about the work, and that is usually not the case. Like I know a lot about the work, but usually when something is finished and comes out of the studio, then starts for me a trajectory of finding out what is it that I actually produced, and what are the questions that come out of that trajectory. So for me, a successful work is one that can function as a question mark, and that can remain a question mark as long as possible, so that I'll be able to keep on working with it.
We finish with a question mark, but there's quite some audience here, so at least the live audience, it's their privilege. They always have the chance, if they have a question, now would be the time. We have a microphone. The people out there and the World Wide Web, of course, can only watch in silence. Any questions? People are totally impressed. Well, Willem.
Vanessa.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure, as always, to have talked to you. And I think we will continue this conversation soon.
I hope so. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to talk to you too.
it must be very strange to sit at home in front of your books. I'm sure that like all the people in the audience try to read like some of the titles and get an idea what you're reading and what you are currently working on. And you can only like see me, and to you it feels like a very like intimate kind of conversation, whereas we sit actually on stage, and you are very big.
I'm happy you didn't tell me that before.
I never do.
I actually thought that was your living room.
So thank you again, Willem de Rooij. Tomorrow we continue with Erika Bolsam in conversation with Luca Lupinto. Bye.
Have a great evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.